Hey there, history enthusiasts! Today we're diving into a realm that's shadowed by anguish and strife. We're journeying into 13 chapters of the most terrifying era in Chinese history. Welcome to Disturbing History Mysteries. This isn't just a history lesson, it's an emotional testament to the resilience and suffering of millions. Brace yourselves. Before we dive into the darkness, it's crucial to understand the grand landscape of ancient China, a land steeped in traditions, philosophy, and innovations. This was the birthplace of Confucius, the Great Wall, and the art of war, but even amidst such splendor, there were periods that shook the very foundations of the empire. And today, we explore one such era. Chapter 1. The Three Kingdoms Period, 222 AD. The Three Kingdoms period is often glamorized in literature, but let's pull back the veil. After the collapse of the Han Dynasty, China was thrown into a violent whirlpool of political chaos. Infighting among factions led to bloody battles where no one was spared. Imagine mothers clutching their children as they hear the approaching hoofbeats of war horses. Picture villagers fleeing their homes, the very soil they toiled turning against them in a crimson tide of warfare. Chapter 2. The Lushan Rebellion 755-763. Just when the Tang Dynasty promised an era of prosperity, the An-Lushan Rebellion tore that promise to shreds. Orchestrated by the general An-Lushan, this devastating chapter in Chinese history led to famine, collapsed governance, and profound suffering. Families were forced into unspeakable choices just to survive, their cries echoing through a disintegrating empire. Chapter 3. The Mongol Conquest 1206-1368. The very word Mongol once sent shivers down the spine of the Chinese populace. Led by Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongol hordes weren't merely conquerors, they were annihilators. Towns disappeared under their hooves, ancient traditions uprooted, and entire cities rendered to ash. Imagine the dread that settled over the land as reports arrived of yet another community devoured by this unstoppable force. Chapter 4. The Qing Dynasty's Decline 1644-1912. The once majestic Qing Dynasty didn't just fall, it crumbled in agonizing slow motion. Long years of corruption, internal strife, and external pressures hollowed out the once proud empire from within. Imagine the collective disillusionment as people saw their leaders become symbols of ineptitude and decay. The fall of the Qing dynasty was not just a political event, it was a prolonged period of demoralization for the entire Chinese population. Chapter 5. The Opium Wars 1839-1860. Let's rewind a bit to the 19th century. The Opium Wars. This was not just a military defeat, it was a humiliation of a nation. The British, wielding military superiority and brutal determination, coerced China into trade that led to widespread opium addiction. Every puff of opium smoke that filled the air was a nail in the coffin of the country's dignity and self-respect. Chapter 6. The Taiping Rebellion, 1850-1864. As if the soul of China hadn't been battered enough, the Taiping Rebellion dealt yet another crushing blow. Led by Hong Xiuquan, who claimed to be the brother of Jesus Christ, this violent uprising caused unimaginable chaos. Picture farmlands turned into killing fields, civilians transformed into unwilling soldiers, and families torn apart. Even after its suppression, the emotional and cultural scars ran deep, sewn into the fabric of the nation. Chapter 7. The 100 Days Reform 1898. In a sorrowful twist of irony, we look at the 100 Days Reform, a burst of hope that was quickly extinguished. Reformers aimed to modernize China, to free it from the shackles of outdated traditions and foreign influence. However, the conservative Qing dynasty quashed these efforts. Picture the frustrated youth, their dreams of change and progress disintegrating before their eyes. Hope was given and then mercilessly snatched away. Chapter 8. The Boxer Rebellion, 1899-1901. The Boxer Rebellion. A desperate uprising fueled by a volatile blend of nationalism and anti-foreign sentiment. Imagine a population so humiliated, so disheartened, that they believed in a mystical force that could make them impervious to bullets. The conflict ended in bitter defeat for the Chinese, with foreign powers imposing even more demeaning conditions. The air was thick with despair. The collective heart of the nation was aching. Chapter 9. The Era of the Warlords, 1916-1928. The Era of the Warlords, following the death of Yuan Shikai in 1916, was like a poison seeping into the body of China, province by province. With the central government weakened, military leaders with their own agendas rose to prominence. Imagine living in a land where the man with the biggest gun writes the laws. Justice, stability, and unity were mere illusions. The perpetual state of strife left the populace yearning for a sense of security that was always just out of reach. Chapter 10. The Invasion of Manchuria, 1931. 1931, a year that echoes in infamy for the Chinese. The invasion of Manchuria by Japan was not merely a territorial dispute. It was a full frontal assault on the Chinese spirit. Innocent lives were caught in a maelstrom of violence, their pleas for mercy lost amid the clamor of gunfire and explosions. Chapter 11. The Tibet Invasion, 1950. 1950, the year that left an indelible scar on the heart of Tibet, as the People's Liberation Army marched into this mountainous land. What ensued wasn't just a territorial takeover, it was a spiritual desecration. Tibetan monasteries, long-standing bastions of faith and wisdom, were violated. Picture ancient scrolls and scriptures tossed aside like meaningless paper, holy sanctums defiled by the very presence of armed soldiers. Each footstep within these sacred halls was a step in the collective soul of the Tibetan people. The invasion struck at the heart of Tibetan Buddhism. Imagine monks and nuns, guardians of wisdom, being forced to abandon their vows, their very essence compromised. The dilution and systematic suppression of the Tibetan language and culture was not a byproduct. It was a strategy aimed at erasing the unique identity of an entire person. Every forced measure, every imposed law, and every desecrated monastery added another layer to the emotional agony that engulfed Tibet. The Tibetan diaspora that followed scattered the seeds of this culture to foreign lands. While the aim may have been to extend a political boundary, what was actually extended was a sea of grief and spiritual emptiness. Imagine leaving your homeland, your spiritual sanctuary, not knowing if you'll ever return to see its holy skies and mountainous grandeur. The emotional toll on those who had to flee is an unspoken tragedy that lingers in the heart of every displaced Tibetan. Chapter 12. The Great Leap Forward, 1958-1961. Just as we're recovering from the heartache of the Cultural Revolution, we stumble upon yet another grim episode. The Great Leap Forward, envisioned as an ambitious plan to transform China into a socialist society, it resulted in the opposite. A catastrophic famine that claimed tens of millions of lives. Picture entire villages decimated, and fields that once teemed with life now barren. The sorrow of empty stomachs and wasted land haunts the country's legacy. Chapter 13. The Cultural Revolution, 1966-1976. And then came the Cultural Revolution, a chilling period that unfolded not so long ago. Mao Zedong's ideological frenzy led to purges and cultural erasure on an unprecedented scale. Schools became places of indoctrination, and respected figures found themselves facing public humiliation or even execution. Think about the agony of a generation as they watched their history and identity being razed before their very eyes. The psychological impact. It's not just the physical toll that's devastating. The psychological scars run deep. These terrifying eras have shaped the collective psyche of the nation. The weight of history is carried not just in textbooks, but in the eyes of the people who still feel the echoes of the past, echoes that implore us to never forget. George Santayana said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Here we are, at the end of this emotional journey through time. If this roller coaster of emotions has moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to keep these lessons front and center. We owe it to ourselves and future generations to never let these horrifying chapters slip into the forgotten corners of history. Until next time.